Before sunrise, when the Nebraska prairie was still covered in frost and the only sounds came from distant windmills turning against the wind, a small forge glowed inside a modest workshop in the town of DeWitt. The air smelled of coal smoke and hot steel. Sparks jumped from an anvil as a blacksmith leaned over another repair job. Nothing about the scene suggested history was being made. Yet inside that workshop, a problem that had frustrated mechanics, farmers, railroad workers, and machinists for generations was about to be solved by a man who had no intention of creating a famous brand. He simply wanted a better tool. His name was William Peterson, and without realizing it, he would eventually build one of the most respected hand tool companies in American history. The early 20th century was an age of machines. America was transforming rapidly. Horses were giving way to automobiles. Farms were becoming increasingly mechanized. Factories expanded across the country. Every machine created new opportunities, but every machine also created new breakdowns. Nuts seized, bolts rounded off, metal parts shifted during repairs. Mechanics constantly found themselves facing the same frustrating reality. They only had two hands. One hand held a component. The other operated a tool. There was never enough grip available when difficult work demanded it. Peterson encountered the problem almost daily. As a blacksmith and mechanic, he spent years repairing equipment for local farmers and businesses. Conventional pliers could grip an object, but only as long as the user maintained pressure. The moment the hand relaxed, the tool released its hold. That limitation seemed small until someone spent thousands of hours repairing machinery. Peterson became convinced there had to be a way to create a tool that could hold itself in place. In 1921, he began experimenting. His idea appeared simple on paper but proved remarkably difficult in practice. The tool needed adjustable jaws capable of gripping different shapes. It needed tremendous clamping force. Most importantly, it needed a mechanism that would lock automatically and remain secure until intentionally released. Countless designs failed. Some slipped under pressure. Others locked unpredictably. Many were too complicated to manufacture economically. Peterson kept refining the concept, testing prototypes in real-world repairs rather than theoretical conditions. Eventually, the breakthrough arrived. The finished design combined leverage, adjustability, and a clever locking mechanism into a single tool. When the handles were squeezed past a certain point, the jaws locked onto the workpiece. The harder the resistance, the tighter the grip became. For the first time, a mechanic could clamp onto an object and free both hands for other tasks. It was not simply another pair of pliers. It was a portable vise that fit inside a toolbox. Peterson called it the Vise-Grip. At first, production barely existed. There was no modern factory, no corporate headquarters, and no sophisticated sales organization. Peterson manufactured tools himself and traveled throughout the region, demonstrating them to customers. Farmers immediately understood the value. Mechanics understood it even faster. The moment someone used a Vise-Grip, the advantage became obvious. Good tools make work easier. Great tools permanently change how work is done. Vise-Grip belonged to the second category. Demand spread through word of mouth. One mechanic showed another. One farmer loaned it to a neighbor. Railroad workers carried stories from town to town. Unlike products that rely on marketing campaigns, Vise-Grip expanded because users became salespeople. Every difficult repair completed with the tool became another advertisement. Every impossible bolt suddenly removed became another recommendation. As orders increased, Peterson Manufacturing began taking shape in DeWitt. The timing was far from ideal. Only a few years later, the Great Depression devastated the American economy. Thousands of companies disappeared. Banks collapsed. Entire industries contracted. Small manufacturers in rural communities often lacked the resources to survive prolonged economic hardship. Yet, Peterson Manufacturing endured. The reason was straightforward. During difficult times, people postpone purchases they want, but they continue buying things they need. Equipment still broke, farms still required maintenance, machinery still demanded repairs. A locking plier that saved time and solved problems remained valuable regardless of economic conditions. While countless businesses vanished, Vise-Grip continued finding customers. The company survived the Depression and then entered another challenge, World War II. The war transformed American manufacturing. Factories shifted toward military production. Industrial capacity became a national priority. Across the country, workers learned new skills and production systems evolved at unprecedented speed. Peterson Manufacturing adapted alongside the rest of American industry, refining manufacturing techniques and expanding capabilities. By the end of the war, the company possessed not only a respected product, but also decades of accumulated production experience. The post-war boom accelerated everything. America built highways, suburbs, factories, farms, and infrastructure on a scale never seen before. Every construction site needed tools. Every mechanic shop needed tools. Every service truck needed tools. Vise-Grip found its way into all of them. Inside DeWitt, the company grew into something larger than a factory. It became the economic heart of the town. Before dawn, pickup trucks filled the parking lot. The sound of machinery echoed through the building. Steel arrived at one end of the facility, and finished tools departed from the other. Families built their lives around factory schedules. Fathers worked there, sons followed them, sometimes grandsons joined as well. A job at Peterson Manufacturing became more than employment. It became a tradition. The workers developed a deep understanding of the product they built. They knew how a locking mechanism should feel. They knew how much force the jaws should apply. They knew the difference between acceptable quality and exceptional quality. Those standards were not written solely in manuals. They existed in experience accumulated over years of repetition. As production increased through the 1950s and 1960s, Vise-Grip quietly became one of the most trusted tools in America. Mechanics kept them within reach during every repair. Welders used them to secure metal before striking an arc. Farmers relied on them in fields far from workshops. Military maintenance crews carried them. Industrial technicians carried them. The tool appeared almost everywhere practical work was being done. What made the success remarkable was how little the design changed. Many products require constant redesigns to remain relevant. Vise-Grip did not. Peterson's original concept proved so effective that the basic mechanism remained largely unchanged for decades. The design became one of those rare engineering solutions that seemed almost timeless. New finishes appeared. Additional sizes appeared. Product lines expanded. But the core idea remained exactly what it had been in 1921. By the 1970s, millions of Vise-Grips were being produced annually. The brand had become synonymous with locking pliers themselves. Customers often asked for a Vise-Grip when they simply meant locking pliers, regardless of manufacturer. Few products ever achieve that level of recognition. It represented decades of trust earned one repair at a time. For the people of DeWitt, the future appeared secure. The factory was busy, orders were strong, the product dominated its category. Workers believed they were building something permanent. What they could not see was that the greatest threat to Vise-Grip would never come from a competing tool. It would come from ownership, because once a company stops being guided by the people who built it and starts being viewed primarily as a financial asset, entirely different questions begin to shape its future. And by the late 1980s, those questions were already approaching DeWitt. On any given morning during the late 1970s, a mechanic somewhere in America was probably reaching for a Vise-Grip without even thinking about it. A farmer repairing equipment in Iowa, a welder in Texas, a machinist in Ohio, a race car technician in North Carolina, all spoke the same language. They did not ask for locking pliers. They asked for a Vise-Grip. The distinction seems small until you realize what it means. A brand had become the category itself. That transformation did not happen through clever advertising campaigns or celebrity endorsements. It happened because generation after generation of workers trusted the tool when failure was not an option. Every rounded bolt removed successfully reinforced the reputation. Every emergency repair completed in the middle of nowhere strengthened customer loyalty. Every difficult job solved with a Vise-Grip made the brand slightly more valuable than the steel from which it was made. Inside DeWitt, the factory operated with the confidence of an institution that seemed permanent. Hundreds of workers moved through the facility each day. Experienced operators trained younger employees. Knowledge passed from one generation to the next. Production targets mattered, but quality mattered more. The workers understood that customers were not buying steel and metal parts. They were buying trust. That trust became the company's greatest asset. Ironically, it was also the reason outside buyers became interested. By the 1980s, Peterson Manufacturing represented something highly attractive in the business world. A dominant product with extraordinary brand recognition and loyal customers. To investors and acquiring companies, brands like that were valuable because they generated reliable profits. The stronger the reputation, the more attractive the acquisition. In 1987, after more than 6 decades under family control, Peterson Manufacturing was sold. For many workers, the news felt important but not alarming. Ownership changes occurred all the time across American industry. The factory remained in DeWitt. The workers kept their jobs. Production continued uninterrupted. Customers still bought the same tools. On the surface, almost nothing changed. Yet beneath the surface, something fundamental had shifted. Under William Peterson and the generations that followed him, the company existed primarily to build great tools. Profit mattered because it allowed the business to survive and grow, but profit was a result of the product. Build an excellent tool and success would follow. Large corporate owners often operate from the opposite direction. The primary objective becomes maximizing financial performance. Products remain important, but they increasingly serve broader goals involving efficiency, margins, and returns on investment. Neither philosophy is inherently wrong. Both can create successful businesses. Problems emerge when the two philosophies begin competing against each other. Throughout the 1990s, manufacturing across the world entered a period of profound change. Improvements in global shipping, logistics, and communication made international production increasingly attractive. Companies discovered they could often manufacture products overseas at significantly lower labor costs than in the United States. What began as an option gradually became an expectation. Corporate executives reviewed spreadsheets showing potential savings. Analysts highlighted opportunities to increase margins. Investors rewarded companies that reduced production costs. Across industry after industry, factories began moving overseas. Some relocations were necessary for survival. Others were undertaken because lower costs promised higher profits. The distinction mattered little to the communities left behind. Throughout this period, DeWitt remained productive. Vise-Grip remained profitable. Customers remained loyal. The workers continued manufacturing one of America's most respected hand tools. Many assumed those facts guaranteed security. Yet the language surrounding the business slowly changed. Corporate visitors increasingly discussed metrics, efficiency, labor expenses, overhead allocations, cost structures, global competitiveness. None of these terms sounded threatening by themselves. Every business measures performance. But veteran employees noticed a difference. Conversations seemed less focused on craftsmanship and more focused on calculations. Less focused on what made Vise-Grip special and more focused on what made Vise-Grip expensive. The concern grew as ownership structures evolved. Eventually, the brand became part of a much larger corporate organization. Compared to the Peterson family business, the scale difference was enormous. What had once been a company built around a single iconic product became one brand among many. That distinction changed perspective. A founder sees a life's work, a corporation sees a portfolio. A founder sees workers, a corporation sees labor costs. A founder sees a community. A corporation sees a facility. The larger the organization becomes, the easier it becomes to evaluate complex realities through numbers alone. Meanwhile, globalization accelerated. Factories across America closed with increasing frequency. Communities built around manufacturing discovered how vulnerable they truly were. Plants that had operated for generations suddenly disappeared after decisions made far away by executives who had never walked through the facilities. They were closing. Many workers in DeWitt watched these stories unfold elsewhere and assumed Vise-Grip would be different. After all, the product remained successful. The factory remained productive. The brand remained dominant. What reason could there be to shut down a business that was still winning? The answer was already taking shape inside conference rooms and financial reports. Someone had started comparing two numbers: the cost of building a Vise-Grip in Nebraska and the cost of building a Vise-Grip somewhere else. For nearly 70 years, the first question had always been, how do we make the best locking plier possible? Now, a different question was becoming more important. How cheaply can we make it? The workers of DeWitt could not yet see the outcome. The machines still ran, the orders still arrived. The parking lot still filled before sunrise. But the future of the factory was no longer being decided by the quality of the tools leaving the production line. It was being decided by spreadsheets. And in the modern manufacturing economy, spreadsheets have a way of changing history far more quickly than anyone expects. By the mid-2000s, the workers in DeWitt could feel something changing, even though nobody had made an official announcement. The factory was still busy. Orders were still arriving. The loading docks still filled with trucks every day. On paper, Vise-Grip remained one of the most successful hand tool brands in America. Yet the conversations coming from corporate headquarters sounded different than they once had. Executives asked fewer questions about quality and craftsmanship and more questions about labor expenses, operating costs, sourcing opportunities, and efficiency metrics. For people who had spent decades building locking pliers, those conversations felt unfamiliar. The product had not changed. The customers had not disappeared. The factory was still producing millions of tools every year, but somewhere far away, attention was shifting from the tool itself to the cost of making it. Throughout the late 20th century, globalization had transformed manufacturing. Faster shipping, cheaper transportation, and expanding international supply chains allowed companies to build products almost anywhere in the world. Across countless industries, executives discovered that products manufactured overseas often cost significantly less than products manufactured in the United States. Factory after factory closed, furniture plants disappeared, textile mills vanished, appliance manufacturers relocated production. Entire communities watched generations of industrial history disappear because someone found a cheaper place to make the same product. Most workers in DeWitt believed Vise-Grip would be different. After all, this was not a struggling company. The brand dominated its category. Customers remained loyal. Mechanics, welders, farmers, and machinists still trusted the tool. The factory had survived the Great Depression, World War II, recessions, and decades of economic change. If success could not guarantee survival, what could? The answer was brutally simple. Success was no longer the deciding factor. Cost was. Somewhere inside corporate offices, analysts compared numbers. The cost of producing a Vise-Grip in Nebraska sat on one side of a spreadsheet. The cost of producing that same Vise-Grip overseas sat on the other. The comparison ignored things that could not be measured easily. It ignored the experience of workers who had spent decades refining production processes. It ignored the pride that came from building a product trusted across America. It ignored the community that depended on those jobs. A spreadsheet can measure labor expenses. It cannot measure craftsmanship. A spreadsheet can compare operating costs. It cannot compare 80 years of manufacturing knowledge. Yet in modern business, numbers often carry more influence than experience. By 2007, rumors began spreading across the factory floor. Veteran employees sensed the warning signs. The language coming from management had changed. Discussions increasingly revolved around costs rather than quality. Investments slowed. Uncertainty grew. Nobody knew exactly what was coming, but many suspected something significant was approaching. Then, in 2008, the announcement finally arrived. The DeWitt factory would close. Production of Vise-Grip locking pliers would move to China. More than 300 jobs would disappear. 87 years of manufacturing history would come to an end. The explanation shocked many workers because of its simplicity. The factory was not closing because it had failed. Customers still wanted the product. Orders were still strong. The company remained profitable. The closure happened because another location could manufacture the same tool at a lower cost. For the people who spent their lives inside the factory, that reality was difficult to accept. Many had expected to retire there. Some had worked in the building for 30 or 40 years. Fathers had passed jobs to sons. Entire families depended on the factory. Suddenly, they were being told that decades of experience mattered less than a calculation on a financial report. The timing made everything worse. America was entering the financial crisis of 2008. Banks were collapsing. Housing markets were falling apart. Unemployment was rising. Opportunities were disappearing across the country. For younger workers, the closure created uncertainty. For older workers, it created fear. Starting over after spending most of a career in one place is difficult under any circumstances. Doing it during an economic crisis felt almost impossible. The impact spread far beyond the factory gates. DeWitt was a small town whose economy revolved around Peterson manufacturing. Local restaurants depended on factory workers buying breakfast and lunch. Gas stations depended on daily commutes. Grocery stores depended on factory paychecks. Schools depended on families supported by manufacturing jobs. Every position inside the plant supported additional jobs throughout the community. When the factory closed, those connections began unraveling. Businesses lost customers. Families moved away. School enrollment declined. Property values weakened. The economic foundation supporting the town began to crack. What made the situation especially painful was that nobody could point to failure. The workers had done their jobs. The product remained respected. The company was profitable. Yet none of those things protected the factory from a decision driven almost entirely by cost. During the final months, the atmosphere inside the building changed completely. Production continued because orders still needed to be filled, but everyone understood they were witnessing the end of an era. Conversations focused on retirement plans, healthcare concerns, mortgages, and uncertain futures. Some employees brought cameras and photographed machines they had operated for decades. Others collected small souvenirs from their workstations, a worn tool, an old badge, a piece of scrap steel, not because those objects were valuable, but because they represented a place that had shaped their lives. Then, the final day arrived. The last shift ended. Workers shook hands, exchanged farewells, and walked toward the parking lot. Machines that had operated for generations fell silent. The loading docks closed. The lights went dark. For 87 years, Peterson Manufacturing had survived wars, recessions, and economic turmoil. What it could not survive was a spreadsheet that concluded the same tool could be made more cheaply somewhere else. When production left DeWitt, the official message seemed straightforward. Customers would still be able to buy Vise-Grip locking pliers. The brand would continue. Retailers would keep stocking the product. Revenue would continue flowing. From a corporate perspective, the transition appeared successful. Costs decreased while the business survived. On financial reports, everything looked exactly as planned. But the first customers who used the new overseas-made Vise-Grips quickly discovered something difficult to explain and impossible to measure with a spreadsheet. The tool still looked like a Vise-Grip. The logo remained familiar. The packaging remained familiar. The locking mechanism still functioned. Yet, for many experienced tradesmen, something felt different. Mechanics, welders, machinists, and technicians spent thousands of hours holding tools in their hands. They noticed details that casual users never see. They noticed the feel of a handle, the precision of a locking mechanism, the consistency of jaw alignment, and the confidence a tool inspires when placed under pressure. Across workshops, garages, and professional forums, discussions began appearing. Some users felt the new versions lacked the consistency of the originals. Others reported subtle differences in fit and finish. None of these complaints suggested the tools were unusable. Most worked perfectly well. The issue was that many professionals believed the old American-made versions felt better. That perception created something remarkable. Tradesmen began searching for older DeWitt-made Vise-Grips instead of buying brand new ones. Garage sales, estate auctions, flea markets, pawn shops, and online marketplaces became hunting grounds for tools manufactured decades earlier. Think about how unusual that is. A used tool produced 30 years ago often became more desirable than a brand new tool carrying the exact same name. Professionals rarely make purchasing decisions based on nostalgia. They choose tools based on performance. If experienced mechanics actively seek older versions, it usually means they believe those versions perform better. What many customers were actually searching for was not simply a tool. They were searching for the craftsmanship behind it. For decades, workers inside the DeWitt factory had developed an intimate understanding of the product they built. They knew exactly how a Vise-Grip should feel when it locked. They understood tolerances, adjustments, and quality standards that had evolved through generations of experience. That knowledge was never fully captured in manuals or blueprints. It existed in habits, instincts, and accumulated expertise. Machines can be relocated, buildings can be replaced. Institutional knowledge is much harder to move. The story of Vise-Grip reflected a broader transformation happening throughout American industry. Throughout the late 20th and early 21st centuries, countless iconic brands passed through mergers, acquisitions, and corporate consolidations. Names that once belonged to founders and communities became assets inside enormous global portfolios. The brands survived. The factories often did not. Every acquisition promised efficiency. Every restructuring promised improved profitability. Many achieved those goals, yet communities frequently paid the hidden cost. In DeWitt, the effects lingered long after production stopped. Businesses closed, families relocated, economic activity slowed. Main Street became quieter. The decline happened gradually rather than dramatically, which somehow made it more painful. Communities rarely disappear overnight. They fade one storefront, one family, and one opportunity at a time. Years later, visitors could still see the former factory standing in town. The walls remained. The loading docks remained. The parking lot remained. Everything looked capable of producing tools. The only thing missing was the work itself. The building became a reminder of what had once existed there. Every silent machine represented knowledge that had moved away. Every empty workstation represented experience that could never be replaced. And perhaps the strangest part of all was that Vise-Grip itself remained successful. Customers still recognized the brand. The product still sold. The logo still occupied shelf space across America. The company had not sacrificed a failing operation. It had sacrificed a successful one. That distinction lies at the heart of the story. This was never a tale about technological disruption or declining demand. It was a story about optimization. The factory closed because someone believed greater profits could be achieved elsewhere. Yet, despite everything, the reputation built in DeWitt never disappeared completely. Every time a collector searches for an original Peterson-made Vise-Grip, that legacy lives on. Every time a mechanic compares a modern version to an older one, the workers of Nebraska remain part of the conversation. Every time someone praises the quality of the originals, they are acknowledging decades of craftsmanship created by people whose names most customers will never know. William Peterson invented a tool designed to hold things together. For nearly 90 years, it held metal together, machines together, and in many ways, an entire community together. The tragedy is that when economics finally pulled the factory apart, there was no locking mechanism strong enough to keep DeWitt from changing forever. For the people of DeWitt, Nebraska, the final months of 2008 felt strangely unreal. The machines were still running. Orders were still arriving. Trucks still backed up to loading docks before sunrise exactly as they had for decades. If a visitor had walked through the factory during those final weeks without knowing what was coming, nothing would have looked unusual. Steel still moved through production lines. Workers still adjusted locking mechanisms by feel. Supervisors still monitored output. Finished Vise-Grips still left the building bound for hardware stores, farms, workshops, and job sites across America. On the surface, it looked like a successful factory doing exactly what it had always done. But everyone inside knew the ending had already been written. The decision had been made far away in conference rooms most of them would never see. Presentations had been delivered. Cost analyses had been reviewed, savings projections had been approved, and once the numbers aligned, nothing happening on the factory floor could change the outcome. The workers were not losing because they had failed. They were losing because they cost more than someone else. That distinction would become the defining tragedy of the entire story. Some of the men and women walking those aisles had spent their entire adult lives inside the building. They arrived as young workers and expected to retire there. Their parents had worked there. Their relatives had worked there. Entire family histories were woven into the factory's existence. In a town the size of DeWitt, Peterson Manufacturing was not simply an employer. It was the economic center around which everything else revolved. The diner depended on factory workers buying breakfast before first shift. Gas stations depended on their commutes. Grocery stores depended on their paychecks. Schools depended on their children. Remove the factory and the entire local economy became vulnerable. During the final months, conversations inside the building changed. Workers no longer talked primarily about production goals or manufacturing schedules. They talked about mortgages. They talked about health care. They talked about retirement plans that suddenly no longer made sense. They talked about finding work in rural Nebraska during one of the worst economic downturns in generations. Many had no clear answers. There were no equivalent employers waiting nearby. The skills they had spent decades mastering remained valuable, but the opportunities to use them were disappearing. Some workers began carrying cameras during their final weeks. They photographed machines they had operated for 20 or 30 years. They photographed co-workers standing beside production lines. They photographed break rooms, workstations, loading docks, and factory hallways. Places that had once seemed ordinary suddenly became important because everyone understood they were about to become memories. Others collected small keepsakes, an old identification badge, a worn tool, a piece of scrap steel from the factory floor. Not because those objects possessed financial value, but because they represented proof that the place had existed. Human beings often do this when institutions disappear. We search for physical reminders because memory alone sometimes feels too fragile. Then the final day arrived. The machines stopped. The presses fell silent. The loading docks closed. Workers exchanged handshakes and final farewells. The parking lot gradually emptied. For 87 years, people had arrived before sunrise, believing there would be another shift tomorrow. Suddenly, there would not be. No dramatic ceremony marked the moment. No national headlines announced the end. No television crews documented the final shutdown. The factory simply stopped. One day, it existed as a living institution. The next day, it existed only as a building. And perhaps that is the strangest thing about industrial decline. Factories that once shaped entire communities often disappear quietly while the rest of the country barely notices. Millions of Americans continued buying Vise-Grips without ever learning where they came from or where they no longer came from. The logo remained unchanged. The product remained available. To most customers, nothing appeared different, but to DeWitt, everything had changed. In the years that followed, the consequences spread through the town. Businesses lost customers, families relocated, school enrollment declined. Economic activity slowed. The process happened gradually rather than dramatically. Communities rarely collapse all at once. They fade slowly. One storefront at a time, one family at a time, one opportunity at a time. Meanwhile, the Vise-Grip name survived. The tool survived. The factory did not. For longtime mechanics, welders, and tradesmen, another change became noticeable. Discussions continued appearing in workshops and online forums, comparing modern versions to the older American-made tools. Many professionals remained convinced that the originals possessed a level of consistency that was difficult to replicate. They searched flea markets, estate sales, auctions, and garage sales, looking for Peterson-made Vise-Grips. Some could identify them instantly. A quick squeeze of the handles, the feel of the locking mechanism engaging, the precision of the jaws, small details invisible to most people but obvious to experienced hands. Those older tools gradually became something more than tools. They became symbols of a manufacturing culture built on experience, repetition, and pride, because a tool is never only steel. It is also the accumulated knowledge of the people who make it. For nearly 9 decades, every refinement inside Peterson manufacturing came from workers who understood exactly how a Vise-Grip was supposed to perform. That knowledge did not exist only in blueprints or engineering drawings. It existed in habits, instincts, and craftsmanship developed over generations. When the factory closed, much of that knowledge disappeared with it. Eventually, ownership changed again. The Vise-Grip brand became part of an even larger corporate portfolio, joining a collection of famous tool names recognized around the world. To investors, it represented a valuable asset with strong brand recognition. To consumers, it remained a trusted name. But William Peterson never set out to create an asset. He set out to solve a problem. That distinction explains why the story continues to resonate long after the factory's closure. In 1921, standing inside a small blacksmith shop in Nebraska, Peterson was not thinking about shareholder value, operating margins, or global sourcing strategies. He was thinking about a mechanic who needed a tool capable of holding something securely while both hands remained free. That practical mission became the foundation of everything that followed. Every generation of workers who came after him inherited the same philosophy. Build something useful, build something reliable, build something that earns trust. Corporate ownership operates according to different priorities. Efficiency matters. Margins matter. Return on investment matters. Those goals are not inherently wrong. Public companies are designed to pursue them. But they are not the same priorities that built Vise-Grip in the first place. That is why the story remains powerful. The factory did not disappear because customers stopped wanting locking pliers. It did not disappear because a superior invention replaced it. It did not disappear because the workers failed. It disappeared because manufacturing economics changed. The people of DeWitt were not competing against a better tool. They were competing against lower labor costs. That is a very different battle. Today, if you drive through DeWitt, the factory still stands. The walls remain, the parking lot remains, the loading docks remain. It is not a ruin in the traditional sense. It is something stranger. It is a building that still looks capable of doing exactly what it was built to do. The only thing missing is the work itself. Stand outside the building and imagine a winter morning in 1975. The parking lot is full before dawn. The air carries the smell of steel and cutting oil. Hundreds of workers move through the doors. Raw steel enters one side of the factory. Finished Vise-Grips leave the other. Some are heading to farms. Some are heading to machine shops. Some are heading to construction sites. Many will spend the next 50 years inside toolboxes across America. Every one of them carries a small piece of DeWitt with it. Now imagine the same scene today. The parking lot is empty. The machines are silent. The workers are gone. The name survives. The product survives. But the place that gave the brand its identity exists only in memory. William Peterson invented a tool designed to lock onto something and refuse to let go. For nearly 90 years, that invention helped Americans hold machines together, hold projects together, and solve problems that seemed impossible. The irony is that while the tool proved strong enough to grip almost anything, there was nothing strong enough to hold together the community that built it. And perhaps that is the lasting lesson of the Vise-Grip story. A company can survive, a brand can survive, a product can survive, but when the people, skills, and places that created them disappear, something valuable is lost that no balance sheet will ever be able to measure.